Kia ora, I'm Chelsea Daniels, and this is The Front Page, a daily podcast presented by the New Zealand Herald. It's been more than 2 years since Cyclone Gabrielle and the Auckland Anniversary Weekend floods.
The storm en route to hit the North Island could be one of the biggest in 20 years.
Be prepared to leave if you need to and have enough supplies to sustain yourself for up to 3 days.
Well, definitely, and this time we have warning. Well, there was no warning last time.
Auckland and Thames Coromandel have extended their states of emergency for another week.
One shopper described the supermarket as crazy busy, with queues going right through the store.
States of emergency have now been declared for Northland, Auckland, Coromandel, Tairāwhiti and Opotiki.
The message is please take care and follow the advice of emergency services.
19 people died. A 3-week-long inquest has begun in Hastings District Court, examining how prepared we were for the cyclone, how warnings were issued, and the emergency response. Today on The Front Page, Open Justice reporter Ric Stevens joins us from court to take us through what we know so far and what we hope to learn from these tragic events. So, Ric, the first phase of the inquest was held in Auckland. Tell me about that.
So the first phase in Auckland was held in August, and it looked at the deaths of 4 people in the Auckland floods and then 2 others, 2 firefighters at Muriwai during Cyclone Gabrielle. That hearing looked at emergency responses and what led to a state of emergency being declared in Auckland, along with the circumstances of the deaths of the people there. The overall inquiry has now moved to Hastings, where it's looking at the fate of people who died as a result of Cyclone Gabrielle on the East Coast.
Tell me a little bit more about the victims and what we know about them.
So in Hawke's Bay, there were initially 7 men who died, 4 women and a little girl. She was sadly Ivy Collins, whose family home in Estdale was flooded. The oldest was Helen Street, 86, who died in Napier. She was dependent on supplied oxygen, and the coroner will be looking into kind of what happened there. Well, one significant development is that we've had an extra name added to the list, and that is that of Joseph Ahuriri. Mr. Ahuriri went missing in his car on the night of the cyclone, and it's been a big kind of local mystery about what happened to him. There've been a number of searches for him since, both on land and at sea, and what happened to him has, been perplexing. The police said they initially didn't think that his apparent death was linked to the cyclone, but now that they have referred it to the coroner, and she has decided to include it in this inquiry.
So that takes the number of deaths that the coroner is looking at in total to 19.
That's correct, yes. So those are covering both Auckland, Hawke's Bay, and some others. Yeah.
I understand that 3 apparent self-inflicted deaths post-cyclone will also be included in the inquiry. What's the reasoning behind that?
So there were 3 deaths occurred in the months after the cyclone. These have been included as being apparently self-inflicted. I can't really tell you too much about that at the moment. There's still non-publication orders around those people. And we'll get to learn more about them in time, I'm sure.
When Cyclone Gabrielle came through, people were cut off for long periods of time. The networks are quite resilient, but they're not resilient enough. And Gabrielle exposed that. Up until Gabrielle, we thought that if you had a handful of cables going into an area like, I think it was Hawke's Bay that was worst affected, towns like Wairoa in Hawke's Bay, they had a handful of lines going into those places, but the lines went across bridges. And the bridges were wiped out, and they cut the lines. And it turns out that having 2 or 3 lines in isn't enough. You need more. So we're building resilience into the network, and we've been doing a lot of work on that since Gabrielle. And Gabrielle was quite a wake-up call for that.
What is the judge looking at when it comes to Cyclone Gabrielle in particular? I mean, what are some of the preliminary issues raised so far?
So the coroner is looking at circumstances of individual deaths, but also things like the flooding risk at places like Eskdale, Puketapu and Te Karaka, and how agencies could have responded to the event, what could have been done better, whether in fact, planning should allow for houses to be built in flood-prone areas, that sort of issue.
And are the issues facing each of those areas quite similar, or are there specifics to each area that they'll be really honing in on?
I think there will be specifics to each area, although although it was a district-wide event, there were things about each area that would be perhaps peculiar.
The response of emergency services will, of course, be under the microscope over the next few weeks, given some people who actually called 111 during the cyclone were told that there was no help available. What do we know about that thus far?
We haven't heard too much about that at the moment, but so the coroner obviously will want to know what happened there. I mean, they were told it wasn't, I think just because the scale of what is happening, the emergency services were stretched really, really to the limit. So the coroner will be looking at what warnings were issued by the authority beforehand, whether messages about what to do were timely and accurate, whether the emergency services were sufficiently prepared. There are also questions about rivers breaking their banks, the mitigations measures that might have been put in place, whether these were adequate. Could the councils have done more?
Generally, what is the point of a coronial inquiry?
Well, like any inquest, I think it seeks to establish the circumstances around a death, but also, are there lessons that can be learned from that? What has happened? How can things be better handled? And, what needs to be avoided in the future in terms of, this sort of event where it's a large-scale event, very complicated with a lot of agencies involved and the coordination between them, things happening in real time very quickly. What can be learned from that? I mean, there may be a whole heap of issues that come out of that that may help planning for future events. But that's kind of what the coroner is all about.
And it's been a couple of years since the events. Have you been speaking to any locals? How are they feeling this coming up again, I suppose?
I haven't had a lot of, I've mentioned to people that it's back on. They're interested in it, of course. But I think they see it as part of the process that has to be gone through.
Who are we likely to hear from over the next few weeks?
So the next 2 weeks, this week anyway, the list of witnesses, mainly sort of fire and emergencies, civil defence, people from the local councils, the police. We'll probably hear more from the families next month. The circumstances around Joseph Ahuriri's disappearance will be considered next year.
Morena. It now seems for most of us that we are past the worst of the current weather event. The review that I announced into what went wrong in the first 24 to 48 hours is underway. Aucklanders began the big Auckland clean-up the very next morning after the flood. You've made me proud and humbled to be your mayor. You've risen to the challenge to look after your neighbours and your local communities, to lend a helping hand. In support, our council staff on the ground, our emergency services and our volunteers have also been magnificent, in some cases putting themselves at risk. Today our council focus moves from the emergency response to provide greater support to the big Auckland clean-up. The big Auckland clean-up is being led by communities, community organisations, local boards, local councils, the private sector, and supported by Auckland Council and central government. So let's show New Zealand and the world the strength of all the communities across our region.
And when it comes to these kind of things, I mean, the witness lists can be enormous. What's it like sitting there and hearing the discussions? Because sometimes it can be quite monotonous, but it's all a part of the process, isn't it?
I think yes, it is all part of the process. We've got 15 councils in what is not so 15 lawyers in a courtroom that's not huge, to be honest. So there's a lot to go through. There are different organisations of people who are represented who will want, to question witnesses and things like that. It is a long process, but then things that happen in the judicial system quite often are.
And tell me again, in terms of emergency services, who will be representing each one of them? I suppose not the exact names, but I'm thinking fire and emergency will be there, no doubt.
Yeah, yes, in fact, we've got a national commander from fire and emergency here who happened to be the district commander at the time. And so, it can be people at quite a high level.
And has there been much interest in and around the courthouse?
Not a great deal at the moment. I mean, it may be different when people know that it's on, but it's mainly sort of professional people who are there today, and or people associated with the organisations that will be called, and mainly their lawyers at the moment. As I say, there's probably around 30 odd people in the courtroom. Half of them are lawyers.
Thanks for joining us, Ric.
You're welcome.
That's it for this episode of The Front Page. You can read more about today's stories and extensive news coverage at nzherald.co.nz. The Front Page is produced by Jane Yee and Richard Martin, who is also our editor. I'm Chelsea Daniels. Subscribe to The Front Page on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts, and tune in tomorrow for another look behind the headlines.